Today we will discuss neurolinguistics and disorder, the study of neurolinguistics and how this study looks at different type of disorders. Among them, the first disorder that we will be discussing is the disorder of syntax. Before we start with the understanding of syntactic disorder, we must be very clear about the fact that what neurolinguistics is. So, neurolinguistics deals with the study which looks at the relationship the brain has with language, and these studies actually tells us that how language is represented in our brain. That is, that how our brain stores knowledge of language or languages that we speak, read, write, and what happens when we acquire these languages, and also what happens when we use them in our everyday life. When we come to the disorders related to language, there are two types of disorders. One is acquired disorder and the other one is the developmental disorder. Acquired disorder results from some kind of injury in the brain, and aphasia is central to the studies of neurolinguistics because that happens due to some injury or damage in the brain. Developmental disorder is not because of some injury, because it is more of a developmental in its nature. So now we will look at the syntactic disorder. Syntactic disorder is problem with sequencing words in a sentence, and people suffering from this kind of disorder have trouble in constructing a sentence. They just simply follow basic noun and verb such as want drink or go market today. They also have spellings and grammatical mistakes as well, and they could be using wrong but related words such as using chair instead of table. Now, syntactic deficits are common in language disorders and have always been the focus of the researchers who are conducting research in the area of language disorders. So now we will look at the syntactic disorder in detail. So the first point is the syntactic deficits, which is basically a Broca's aphasia and an acquired language disorder caused by strokes affecting left frontal region. The core symptom of Broca's aphasia is an agrammatic, spontaneous speech production, which is characterized by omission of central functional elements and a severe reduction of the length and syntactic complexity of utterances. Speakers suffering from this disorder gives the impression of lacking syntactic structure. Agrammatic Broca's aphasia was therefore considered the ideal candidate for investigating syntactic deficits and has been at the focus of linguistic investigation, which concerns with syntactic disorders ever since the advent of modern generative syntactic theory by Chomsky. Then the interest on agrammatic Broca's aphasia was also furthered by the assumption that Wernicke's aphasia constituted a syndrome mirroring the disorders observed in Broca's aphasia. Individuals with Wernicke's aphasia typically suffer from a damage or injury to temporoparietal brain regions and display marked language comprehension deficits in the word retrieval. These symptoms were considered as indicative of a lexical semantic disorder. Then the assumed dichotomy between intact lexical semantic and impaired syntactic abilities in Broca's aphasia and spared syntactic but affected lexical semantic capacities in Wernicke's aphasia. So we look at the Broca's aphasia and also see that how things in this kind of aphasia are there also in the Wernicke's aphasia or not. Now, in Wernicke's aphasia is seen the evidence shows that for a dual architecture of language system encompassing a short-edge component which is lexicon and syntax, both contains the operations to generate composite hierarchical structures such as phrases and sentences out of stored element in mental lexicon. In the 1990 then, the discovery of the British KE family, which is a huge 3-generational family in which about half of the members suffer from an inherited speech and language disorder, drew the attention to the developmental language disorder, specifically to the language disorder called SLI, which is specific language impairment. Now, this impairment displays severe problems in acquiring inflectional morphology, verb movement, and complex syntactic structure such as relative clauses or passives. Although further genetic investigation have revealed that the point mutation discovered by the KE family is not regularly observed in other individuals with specific language impairment. The genetic basis underlying the specific syntactic deficit observed in syndrome ultimately uncovering those aspects of language capacity that are genetically specified in our species. Research on syntactic deficits has also taken other language disorders such as Down syndrome, Parkinson's syndrome, and autism into focus. Today, there is hardly any acquired or developmental disorder syndrome associated with language impairments for which a deficit affecting the syntactic domain is not discussed. Such syndromes include developmental disorders such as specific language impairment, Williams syndrome, Down syndrome, autism, and acquired language deficits such as aphasic language disorder, which includes Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. So the investigation of language deficits certainly merits some research efforts on syntactic disorder. Further research also aims to advance syntactic theory by taking into account language impaired individuals.